The road is quiet now, just a narrow, twisting strip of pavement cutting through the rolling hills of Oto County, Nebraska. It looks ordinary in the daylight, just another rural highway surrounded by farmland and trees. But when the sun sets, that's when the stories begin. Some say if you drive this road at night, your engine might die without warning, your headlights might flicker out, and if you listen carefully, if you're unlucky, you might hear screaming. Not just one voice, but 7. And if you linger on that road long enough, you'll swear the air itself feels different, heavier, watchful. The kind of silence that makes you roll your windows up without thinking, as if that thin glass could keep out the dark. For over a century, locals have whispered about this place. They call it Seven Sisters Road, a name heavy with tragedy, shrouded in mystery, and soaked in fear. And no matter which version of the story you hear, the ending is always the same: 7 young women dead. In every state, there's a story they don't like to tell, a mystery left unsolved, a secret buried beneath the surface, a moment in time where something went terribly wrong. Welcome to History's Dark Corners, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on America's most unsettling stories, one state at a time. I'm Melissa Hamblin, and tonight we're heading out to the farmlands of Nebraska. Picture rolling hills, a quiet road, and more cornfields than you can count. Seems peaceful, right? Well, don't get too comfortable, because one lonely stretch of pavement here has earned a reputation as one of the creepiest places in the Midwest: Seven Sisters Road. So pin Nebraska to the map, keep your lantern lit, and let's step into the shadows. Seven Sisters Road isn't its real name. On a map, it's just L Road, winding through the countryside a few miles south of Nebraska City. But honestly, no one calls it that. To locals, it's always been Seven Sisters. And that alone tells you something, doesn't it? When the official name fades but the legend sticks, you know which one really mattered. That name comes from a story whispered in hushed voices for over a century. And like most folklore, the details change depending on who's telling it. You can almost hear the layers of retelling. Parents warning their kids not to wander, teenagers daring each other with scarier twists, grandparents swearing their version is the real one. The specifics blur, but the dread, that stays sharp. Sometimes the time period shifts, sometimes the characters, but always there are 7 sisters, and always there is death. That's the part no version lets you escape from. No matter how the story starts, it always ends the same way: 7 young women gone. The most common version of the story begins not with a road, but with a house. A farmhouse standing alone in the rolling hills of Nebraska in the late 1800s. White clapboard siding weathered by wind and rain, shutters rattling in the breeze, a lantern glowing faintly in the kitchen window. The land around it was quiet, no neighbors for miles, just fields stretching toward the horizon and a dense patch of woods to the east. Nights out here would have been dark in a way we almost forget today. No street lamps, no glow from nearby towns, just starlight, maybe a sliver of moon, and the restless sound of wind moving through the grass. Inside that house lived a family, 7 daughters and 1 son. We don't know their names. The story doesn't preserve details like that. Maybe the sisters were teenagers, or maybe they were young women already dreaming of marriage, children, and a life beyond the farm. What the story does preserve is this: 1 brother and something dark festering inside him. Some say he was jealous, always in the shadow of his sisters. Some say he was unstable, prone to violent outbursts. Others whisper about shame, about secrets, about the possibility that he feared losing control over his family if his sisters chose to leave. And that's what makes this version so unsettling, because we'll never know his true motive. Was it rage, control, madness? The not knowing is part of what keeps the story alive. Whatever the reason, one night he snapped. The story says it happened after the sun went down, when the land was cloaked in silence. The sisters were inside, maybe gathered around the kitchen table, maybe preparing for bed, when their brother called the first one outside. She probably didn't think anything of it, a brother asking for help with the animals or to fetch something from the barn. It wouldn't have seemed unusual. She grabbed her shawl, stepped into the cool night air, and followed him down the dirt path that led toward the trees. But she didn't come back. A few minutes later, he called for another sister, then another. One by one, they left the house, each expecting to be gone only a moment, each unaware of what had already happened to the others. The night stretched on, the lantern in the farmhouse window burning lower and lower. The silence deepened until, at last, 7 young women had vanished into the darkness, and the brothers stood alone. By morning, the truth was no longer hidden. Neighbors traveling the road came upon a scene they would never forget. 7 sisters hanging from the trees that lined the path. Their brother had turned on his own family, and he hadn't tried to hide it. He'd displayed it for the world to see. This version of the legend is the one most often told. It's the one whispered at sleepovers, the one that makes teenagers shiver when they dare each other to drive the road after dark. And maybe that's because it plays on something universal. Not the fear of strangers, but the fear of family turning against you, of trust broken in the most violent way possible. And maybe that's why this version endures, because it doesn't rely on the supernatural. It's about jealousy, rage, and betrayal. And those are horrors we know are real. There's another version of the story, one that shifts the tragedy away from the settler's farmhouse and into a much older history. In this telling, the 7 sisters weren't farm girls at all. They were native women. Some say they were accused of witchcraft. Others say they were taken prisoner during conflicts with settlers. Still, others whisper they were executed for breaking tribal law. No matter which version you hear, the ending is the same: 7 women put to death, and their spirits left to wander the hills that would one day be called 7 Sisters Road. To understand why this version persists, you have to step back and look at the land itself. Long before Nebraska was a state, before farmhouses dotted the hills, this was the home of the Oto and Missouri tribes. They lived along the Missouri River, fishing its waters, hunting the rich game of the plains, tending fields of corn, beans, and squash. But by the 1800s, their world was shrinking. Settlers poured westward, staking claims on land that had been native ground for centuries. With them came disease, treaties signed under duress, and forced relocations. By the mid-1850s, the Oto and Missouri had been pushed out entirely, resettled on reservations far to the south. Conflict was inevitable. Skirmishes broke out between settlers and native bands. Rumors of raids spread quickly in small towns, and fear of the other ran deep. And fear, as we know, breeds stories. It's in that climate that the native version of the 7 Sisters legend likely took root. Some say the women were executed by settlers, killed as vengeance for a raid that may or may not have happened. Others insist it was tribal justice, that the sisters had broken a sacred law and their deaths were carried out by their own people. But of course, there's no written record to confirm any of this. But that's the nature of oral history. It survives in fragments, in whispers, in stories that shift with each retelling. And it's worth noting, frontier newspapers didn't always record the deaths of native people, especially women. Violence could pass without notice, at least in print, which means silence in the record doesn't always mean silence in the land. Still, when you stand on that road, it's easy to feel the weight of what came before. The hills themselves carry memory. Generations of people lived and died here long before Nebraska became part of the United States. To some, the cries heard on 7 Sisters Road aren't the echoes of farm girls murdered by their brother, but the voices of native women, their stories erased, their lives cut short. And maybe that's why this version has survived, because even if the details have blurred, the land remembers. The grief of displacement, the violence of frontier conflict, it leaves a scar that folklore tries to explain. So when travelers hear screams in the night or see shadows shifting in the trees, this telling offers a different answer. The 7 sisters weren't settlers at all. They were native women bound forever to the land that was taken from them. And before we move on, a quick note. Whenever folklore ties itself to native history, we have to be careful. These stories are usually retold through the lens of settlers, not the people whose land this was. That means the details might be distorted or even invented to explain away real conflict and trauma. So while the 7 native women version of the legend is an important part of what people say about this road, it's just as important to recognize that it may reflect bias and exclusion as much as memory. That telling ties the legend to cultural conflict and displacement, but some versions pull away from betrayal and violence altogether and instead suggest tragedy came from something far more ordinary. In these versions, the sisters' deaths weren't the result of a brother's rage or a vengeful execution. They were the result of something far more ordinary, and maybe, in a way, more believable. One of the most common accident-based versions begins with a wagon ride. 7 sisters bundled together, maybe on their way to town or returning home after church. The dirt road beneath them was steep and uneven, the kind of hill that tested the strength of horses and the nerves of anyone holding the reins. The horses spooked. Maybe it was a sudden noise from the woods, maybe the snap of a branch or the shadow of a deer darting across the path. Whatever it was, the team bolted, hooves pounding, the wagon rattling wildly as it careened down the incline. The sisters screamed, clinging to each other, but the weight of the wagon pulled faster than the horses could control. A wheel hit a rut, the wagon tipped, and in an instant it was over. The wreck left 7 young women lost on the side of the road. No betrayal, just a tragic accident on a dangerous stretch of land. And if you've ever been on an old dirt road with a horse team or even just tried to hold a car steady on gravel, you know how quickly control can slip away. That's part of why this version feels so believable. Another telling ties their deaths not to the wagon, but to a family feud. Life on the Nebraska frontier wasn't easy. Land disputes could turn deadly. Neighbors argued over property lines, livestock, water rights, and sometimes those arguments escalated. In this version, the sisters were caught in the crossfires of someone else's anger. A feud gone too far, shots fired in the night, a home set ablaze, and when the dust settled, 7 daughters were gone, innocent victims of the violence that seemed to stalk every frontier settlement. And then there's the darkest of the accident variations, the suicide pact. In this telling, the sisters weren't killed by accident at all. They chose to die. Why? Well, the reasons change with every retelling. Some say they had been forbidden from marrying the men they loved, their future stolen from them by strict parents or an overbearing brother. Others say they were overcome by grief after the death of their parent, unable to face a harsh world alone. Whatever the cause, the legend whispers that they walked out together into the hills one night and never returned. Some say they drank poison, others say they ended their lives side by side beneath the trees, 7 sisters bound together in life and death. It's the most tragic version of all, not because of violence from outside, but because of despair from within. These accident-based tellings lack the gothic flair of the murderous brother. They don't carry the cultural weight of the native execution tale, but they're believable. They fit the dangers of the time. Wagon accidents were common, feuds were real, and despair was often close at hand. And maybe that's why people still tell them, because even without curses, even without vengeful spirits, the truth is haunting enough. Life on the frontier was fragile, and 7 lives could be snuffed out in a single instant. With so many different versions, it's easy to get lost in the details. So what does history actually say? Of course, legends are slippery things. They shift, they stretch, they survive because people keep retelling them, not because they can be pinned down in a newspaper article or a dusty archive. So what's the truth behind 7 Sisters Road? If 7 young women were murdered or even died together in a tragic accident, you'd expect to find some record of it. Otoe County had newspapers by the late 1800s. They reported on barn dances, crop failures, and crimes big and small. A sensational story like the slaughter of 7 sisters should have made headlines. But there's nothing, no court records, no coroner's reports, no obituaries listing 7 names all at once, no docket number, no gravestones grouped together, just silence. Skeptics point to this silence as proof the story is pure invention, and maybe they're right. But history isn't always so tidy. Nebraska in the 1800s wasn't the neat, orderly farmland you might picture today, and frontiers are messy places. Nebraska City itself was a bustling hub by the mid-19th century. It sat along the Missouri River, its docks crowded with steamboats. Goods moved in and out, lumber, fur, produce from the orchards that dotted the hills. The courthouse square buzzed with traders, shopkeepers, and gossip. But just beyond the riverfront, the countryside was wild. Families carved homesteads out of the land, often miles from the nearest neighbor. Life was harsh. Droughts and blizzards could wipe out crops, illness spread quickly, sometimes claiming entire families before a doctor could arrive, and violence was never far away. Disputes between settlers often boiled over into feuds. Property lines, livestock, even insults could spark bloodshed. There were murders that never saw a courtroom, disappearances that were never solved. And then there was vigilante justice. In 1860, just across the river in Iowa, a man accused of murder was dragged from his cell and lynched by a mob before he could face trial. In Nebraska itself, newspapers occasionally reported on hangings, sometimes carried out by the law, sometimes by men who decided to take the law into their own hands. But lynchings weren't always publicized. If a community wanted a crime hushed up, if the accused was someone important, or if the victims were people society didn't value, the story might never leave the county. Oral history would carry it, but not print. And that's the danger of only looking at the record. Silence in the archives doesn't always mean silence in the land. Sometimes it means someone wanted the story buried. And then, of course, there's the matter of native displacement. The Ottawa Missouri tribes had lived on this land for centuries, and they were pushed out in the 1850s. Treaties forced them south into Kansas and eventually into Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. That removal wasn't peaceful. Skirmishes, executions, and violent retribution marked the process. So when locals insist that something happened on Seven Sisters Road, something too terrible to be forgotten, it's not hard to imagine where that certainty comes from. It may not have been 7 sisters hanged by their brother. It may not have been a wagon wreck or a suicide pact. But in a place shaped by violence, by tragedy, by loss, a story like this feels true. And sometimes, in folklore, feeling true is enough. That's the uneasy space Seven Sisters Road occupies, somewhere between fact and legend. No official record, no names, but a story so deeply woven into the community that it might as well be carved into the hills themselves. History leaves us with silence. What keeps the legend of Seven Sisters alive isn't just the old stories of murder and betrayal. It's what people say still happens on that road today. Because the haunting isn't something confined to the past. It's ongoing. Drive L Road after dark and you'll notice it right away. The trees lean in close, their branches forming a kind of tunnel. Headlights catch strange shadows. The road dips and climbs just enough that your stomach flips as you crest the hills. And for long stretches, there's no sound at all. Just the hum of your own engine and the crunch of gravel under your tires. It feels isolated, cut off, the kind of place where anything could happen, and sometimes people say it does. Picture yourself pulled over for just a moment, killing the engine, rolling down the window. The silence is so deep it almost hums. The air is colder than it should be, and every creak of a branch feels magnified, like the trees themselves are leaning closer to listen. That's when the stories say things start. One of the most common reports is car trouble. Cars dying without warning, headlights cut out, radios crackle, and just when panic sets in, that's when the screams begin. They say you can hear women screaming in the trees, high-pitched, desperate, echoing as though carried on the wind. Some describe it as a chorus, 7 voices rising at once. Others say it's more like crying, a faint sobbing that grows louder the longer you sit in silence. One driver swore he heard the words "help me" whispered from the roadside, though when he stopped and shone his flashlight, there was nothing but empty woods. Another claimed the scream grew so intense that he floored the accelerator and sped off the road entirely, his car crashing into a ditch. He walked away shaken, but he never drove L Road again. And here's the thing. Almost every telling ends the same way. The sound doesn't just spook you, it drives you out, as if whatever lives on that road doesn't want you to stay. Others say they've seen figures in the tree line, pale shapes, shadows darting across the road, always gone when the headlights hit. Real or imagined? Either way, your body reacts like they're real. Then there are the lights, glowing orbs floating among the trees. Sometimes they're blue, sometimes white. They bob like lanterns carried by invisible hands, always just out of reach. A group of paranormal investigators once set up along the road, cameras ready. They claimed to capture strange flashes darting through the trees, lights that vanished when approached. Skeptics called it swamp gas or reflections. Believers say it's proof the sisters are still trying to be seen. Now, no legend feels complete until someone dares you to prove it. On Seven Sisters, the most famous dare is to honk your horn 7 times. Do it, locals say, and you'll hear the sisters scream back at you. Another involves killing your headlights at midnight, sit in silence, and wait. Some say the sisters will appear in front of your car, blocking the road. Others say they'll climb into the back seat, silent passengers until you turn your lights back on. And then there's the hill test. Put your car in neutral on the steepest incline, and wait. Some claim unseen hands will push your vehicle forward, 7 sets of hands working together. Of course, it's all part of the folklore now. Teenagers daring each other, couples testing their nerves, ghost hunters bringing equipment, everyone looking for proof, or at least a thrill. But let me pause here for a quick reality check. Don't actually try these out. Seven Sisters Road is narrow, it's rural, and people live nearby. Stopping in the middle of a road at night or killing your headlights just isn't risky, it's dangerous. Legends are fun to tell, but safety and respect always come first. Now, skeptics will tell you these experiences are tricks of the environment. Engines strain on steep inclines, trees bend in the wind, creating eerie shapes. Crickets and owls make noise that sounds strange in the silence. And when you already expect to hear screams, the rustling of leaves can be enough to send your heart racing. But for those who've been there at night, who've felt their headlights flicker out, who've sat frozen as screams echoed from the trees, they're not so quick to dismiss it. The road doesn't need proof, it has reputation. And reputation is enough to keep people coming back, daring themselves to experience something they can't explain. And that's what makes Seven Sisters Road different from a story in a book. It isn't locked away in the past, it's alive, still happening, still being added to every time someone drives the road in the dark and swears they experienced something they can't explain. Over the years, countless Nebraskans have come forward with their stories, and while skeptics will say it's all coincidence or imagination, the details are chillingly consistent. One man remembered driving the road late at night with 3 friends back in high school. They'd been dared to honk the horn 7 times, and of course they did it. At first, nothing happened. They laughed, called the legend fake, but then, halfway up one of the steepest hills, the car stalled. The engine cut out completely and the headlights flickered into darkness. The group sat frozen, the night pressing in around them. And then they heard it. At first, it sounded like the wind, a faint whistle through the trees. But then the pitch rose, high, unmistakably human, screaming. Not one voice, but several. The driver twisted the key again and again, desperate to restart the engine. Finally, the headlights flared back to life. They sped away, not daring to look back. To this day, he swears he heard 7 distinct voices in the dark. In another story, a young couple once parked along the roadside after midnight. The night was clear, the moon was bright enough to paint silver shadows across the fields. They'd only been sitting a few minutes when they saw headlights cresting the hill behind them, a pair of glowing beams cutting through the dark, moving closer and closer. They braced for the car to pass, but just as the lights reached the top of the hill, they vanished. No car, no sound of an engine, nothing. The woman insisted the lights were still there, hovering just behind them like eyes in the night, but the man said they were completely gone. Either way, neither could explain how something so solid could disappear so fast. One paranormal investigator recalled pulling over with a small team to set up cameras. As they scanned the tree line with flashlights, they froze. There, just beyond the reach of the beams, hung several figures in the trees. Pale shapes swaying in the night air, ropes stretching into the branches. They rushed forward, hearts pounding, but as the light touched the trees, the figures dissolved into nothing. The branches were empty. Later, when they checked their video footage, all they found was static. In another story, a group of teenagers once decided to try the headlights off dare. They parked halfway down the road, killed the lights, and waited in silence. At first, there was only the sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, crunching on gravel, moving toward the car. The teens whispered frantically, trying to decide if they were imagining it, but the sound grew louder, circling the car as if someone, or something, was walking around them in the dark. One of the boys flicked the headlights back on, and in an instant the footsteps stopped. Nothing was there, no one on the road, and no footprints in the dust. Not all the encounters involve screams or figures. Some are quieter, but no less terrifying. One woman who grew up in Nebraska City said she drove the road just once, in broad daylight. She didn't hear anything, she didn't see anything, but the moment her tires touched the pavement, she was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. Her chest tightened, her palms began to sweat. She felt watched, though there was no one in sight. By the time she reached the end of the road, she was shaking, and she never went back. And those aren't the only stories. People talk about headlights that follow them but never pass, fog that appears out of nowhere and then disappears just as quickly, the sound of fingernails tapping on a car hood, tire tracks that lead into the road and then vanish as if the car simply lifted off the ground. These stories vary. Some involve sights, others sound, others just a feeling that can't be shaken. But they all end the same way, with witnesses convinced that something lives on that road, something that refuses to rest. Legends like Seven Sisters Road don't stick around for over a century just because they're spooky. They last because they hit something deeper. Symbols that echo across cultures, numbers that carry weight, archetypes we recognize even if we can't explain why. So let's step back for a second and look at the building blocks of this legend. First, the number itself, 7. It shows up everywhere in myth and religion. In Christianity, there are 7 days of creation, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 virtues. In Judaism, the menorah has 7 branches, and the 7th day, Shabbat, is sacred. In Islam, there are 7 heavens and 7 circles to walk around the Kaaba. Ancient cultures loved 7 too. Greeks told stories of the 7 sages, wise men who shaped philosophy. Hinduism has the 7 chakras, centers of spiritual energy in the body. And in old folklore, breaking a mirror supposedly gives you 7 years of bad luck. It's a number that feels complete, whole, and final. So when people tell a story about 7 sisters, it feels destined, like the number itself demands a legend. Would the story be as powerful if it were 5 sisters or 8? Probably not, but 7 just carries weight. Then there's the image of the sisters. Across cultures, groups of sisters pop up again and again. The Pleiades, the 7 sisters constellation, have inspired myths from Greece to Japan to Native America. In Greek myth, they were the daughters of Atlas, chased by Orion until Zeus placed them in the heavens for protection. In Cherokee tradition, the 7 sisters were children who danced in the sky, becoming stars. Fairy tales, too, love the motif of sisters. They're often innocent, vulnerable, bound together by fate, and their unity makes their loss feel all the more devastating. And finally, the setting, a road. Roads have always been liminal places, thresholds between one world and another. Think about it. A road is never ending. It's always a path between destinations. When you're on it, you're in transit, neither here nor there. That in-between state makes us uneasy. Folklore recognizes this. Haunted roads appear everywhere. Crybaby bridges in Ohio and Maryland, Clinton Road in New Jersey, and Archer Avenue outside Chicago where Resurrection Mary still hitchhikes. Each has its own details, but the pattern is the same. Roads become the stage for tragedy, fear, and lingering ghosts. Seven Sisters Road fits right into that tradition. The number 7, the archetype of sisters, and the liminal space of the road all layered together into one story. And maybe that's the real reason Seven Sisters Road hasn't faded away. It doesn't just belong to Nebraska. It belongs to a bigger tradition of haunted roads everywhere. But what gives this particular story its staying power isn't only the setting, it's the way the legend taps into our deepest fears. Whenever you run into a story like this one that refuses to die even when there's no hard evidence, you have to ask the question, why? Why do people keep telling it? Why do they believe it? What purpose does it serve? There are a few theories. One explanation is simple. The story was meant to scare kids away from a dangerous road. Seven Sisters Road is steep and winding. Even in daylight, the hills can be treacherous. Horses and wagons could easily have overturned in the 1800s, and cars still struggle here today. So imagine a parent who wanted to keep their children from wandering too far, or from sneaking out late at night. What better way than a cautionary tale? Don't go down that road, it's cursed. Don't drive it after dark, you'll hear the sisters scream. The story sticks because it does its job. It turns a risky stretch of road into forbidden ground. And we see this pattern in folklore everywhere. Don't swim after dark or the lady in white will drag you under. Don't cut through the cemetery or you'll bring home a ghost. Folklore often hides a practical message inside the supernatural. Another theory is that something did happen here, something small, maybe even unremarkable on its own, but that grew into legend. Maybe one woman was murdered along the road, maybe 2 sisters died in an accident. Over time, the story snowballed. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, until eventually it was 7. Think about other legends. The Bell Witch in Tennessee started with one family's strange experiences. Now it's a sprawling tale of curses, possessions, and even presidential encounters. Legends magnify over time. Seven Sisters Road may be the same, a single tragedy amplified until it filled the whole landscape. And then there's the darker explanation, that the story is a reflection of the violence that really did happen here, even if it's not the exact way the legend described. The displacement of the Oto and Missouri tribes, skirmishes between settlers and native bands, vigilante justice, lynchings. Imagine living in a place where death and violence felt close at hand. where you knew neighbors who'd been killed in accidents or heard rumors of bodies found in the woods. Even if the details weren't true, the feeling was. Folklore, in a way, is a processing of trauma. It takes real fear, real violence, and gives it a story, a shape, something to point to, something to retell. So maybe the Seven Sisters never existed, but the people of Otto County needed a story to explain the unease that hung over the road, and this is the one they chose. Finally, there's the simplest theory of all. People just like a good scare. Teenagers daring each other to honk their horns 7 times, couples parking along the road to test their courage, ghost hunters setting up cameras in the middle of the night. The story gives people an excuse to feel fear in a controlled way, to seek out the adrenaline rush of being spooked without real danger. Think of urban legends everywhere. Bloody Mary in the mirror, the babysitter and the man upstairs. They're fun to tell because they make your heart race. Seven Sisters Road works the same way. It's a communal thrill, a dare, a legend that gives ordinary people the chance to brush up against the unknown. So which theory is right? Maybe all of them. Maybe the story began as a warning to keep kids away from a dangerous stretch of road. Maybe it grew from a small tragedy, 1 death, maybe 2, that ballooned into legend. Maybe it absorbed the cultural trauma of a violent frontier. And maybe it lasted this long simply because people love a good scare. The truth is, folklore doesn't need one answer. Its power comes from being many things at once: warning, memory, thrill, and story. And Seven Sisters Road is all of that, layered into a legend that refuses to fade. The legend isn't just stronger than fact or history, it's alive. 7 sisters bound forever to the hills of Nebraska. So if you ever find yourself near Nebraska City and someone dares you to drive down L Road at midnight, remember what waits there. 7 voices in the dark, 7 shadows in the trees, 7 lives cut short, their story told and retold until it became legend. And this is just one story among many. Another pin in the map, another shadow uncovered, but the darkness never ends. So keep your lantern lit, and I'll see you in the next dark corner of history. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows of Nebraska, don't forget to follow History's Dark Corner so you never miss an episode. And if you've got a minute, a quick rating or review helps more people find the show, and it keeps the lanterns burning here in the map room. And hey, if you've got your own hometown legends, eerie encounters, or strange bits of folklore you'd like me to dig into, I'd love to hear them. You can always email me at historiesdarkcornerspodcast@gmail.com or find me on social media under History's Dark Corners. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit because the dark is never empty and there's always more to uncover. I'll see you in the next dark corner of history.